What if I told you that the most powerful man on earth, the guy who built his entire brand on the art of the deal, just sat across the table from Xi Jinping and walked away with less than he wanted? What if the man who slapped China with the highest tariffs in modern American history, who threatened to cut off the world's second-largest economy, ended up being the one who blinked first? Because that's exactly what a growing number of analysts are saying happened on October 30th, 2025, in a room at the Gimhae International Airport in Busan, South Korea. Two of the most powerful leaders on the planet, face-to-face, for 100 minutes that could reshape the global economic order for the next decade. And what came out of that room is something that has traders, diplomats, and geopolitical strategists all talking at once. You are watching this channel because you want to understand the world the way it actually works, not the sanitized version, not the spin, but the real game behind the headlines. And today we are going deep. So if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the moment to hit that button and ring that bell, because this story is only going to get bigger. And if you find value in this breakdown, drop a like. It genuinely helps more people find this kind of content. Let's set the scene. Trump had just wrapped up a 5-day swing through Asia, his first trip to the Indo-Pacific since returning to the White House for his second term. He met with allies, pressed the flesh with regional leaders, and saved the biggest event for last. The meeting with Xi Jinping was held on the sidelines of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit, and the stakes could not have been higher. Leading into that meeting, both countries had been locked in a brutal economic standoff that had rattled markets from Wall Street to Shanghai. To understand what was at play in that room, you need to go back to the beginning of this second Trump term. Almost from day one, Trump came out swinging on China. Tariff after tariff, executive order after executive order. He imposed an additional 20% tariff on Chinese goods under the argument that China was allowing fentanyl precursor chemicals to flow into the United States, fueling an opioid crisis that has killed hundreds of thousands of Americans. Then in April, he escalated dramatically, pushing total tariffs on Chinese imports up to 145%, a number so staggering it genuinely felt like economic warfare. China hit back. That's what China does now, it hits back. Gone are the days when Beijing would quietly absorb American pressure and wait it out. Under Xi Jinping, China has developed what analysts are calling a counter-pressure doctrine. When Washington punches, Beijing punches back. And so China slapped 125% tariffs on American goods. Then it targeted American farmers, hitting soybeans, corn, and other agricultural products with a 15% retaliatory tariff in March. And when the tension kept escalating, China played what many are calling its most powerful card of all: rare earth minerals. Now, if you don't know what rare earths are, let me explain why this matters so much. Rare earth elements are a group of 17 metallic elements that sound like something out of a science fiction novel: neodymium, dysprosium, terbium, europium. These are not just curiosities on the periodic table. These materials are absolutely essential for the modern economy. They go into the magnets inside electric vehicle motors. They go into wind turbines. They are critical components in the weapons systems that the United States military depends on, from F-35 fighter jets to guided missile systems. They are used in smartphone manufacturing, in semiconductor fabrication, in the entire ecosystem of advanced technology that underpins both economic and military power. And China controls approximately 80 to 90% of global rare earth processing capacity. That's not a typo. The world's most powerful military and economic superpower is almost entirely dependent on its greatest geopolitical rival for materials that are fundamental to its national security. On October 9th, just 3 weeks before the Busan meeting, China dropped the hammer. Beijing announced sweeping export controls on rare earth elements, effectively threatening to cut off the United States from materials it cannot source elsewhere at scale. It was a masterstroke of economic statecraft, and it sent the Trump administration into a quiet panic. Reports emerged that Washington was internally alarmed. The Pentagon was alarmed. The defense industry was alarmed. And the financial markets reacted accordingly. Suddenly, the dynamic shifted. Trump had been threatening to hit China with an additional 100% tariff starting November 1st if the rare earth situation wasn't resolved. But she had made it clear Beijing was not going to blink. And so the two leaders found themselves face to face in South Korea, each holding enormous leverage over the other, and neither willing to admit they needed the other more than they wanted to show. The meeting opened in what reporters described as a warm atmosphere. Trump greeted Xi as a friend and a great leader, saying it was an honor to meet with him. Xi, for his part, said he felt warm encountering Trump again, and acknowledged that while the United States and China do not always see eye to eye, the two countries should strive to be partners and friends. For a relationship that has been defined by confrontation, sanctions, blacklists, and billion-dollar trade penalties, those words felt almost surreal. But beneath the diplomatic warmth, the negotiating was fierce. After 100 minutes, 1 hour and 40 minutes of what we can only imagine was extraordinarily intense dialogue, the two sides emerged with what they called a consensus. Let's break down exactly what was agreed to, because the details matter enormously. First, tariffs. The United States agreed to cut the so-called fentanyl tariff, the 20% levy imposed over China's alleged role in the opioid crisis, in half, down to 10%. That reduction, effective immediately, brought the overall tariff rate on Chinese goods down from 57% to approximately 47%. Now, 47% still sounds enormous. And it is. But the direction of travel matters. For months, the only direction tariffs were moving was up. Now, for the first time, they moved down. Second, rare earths. China agreed to pause, for 1 year, the sweeping export controls it had announced on October 9th. This was the immediate crisis that threatened to ignite a full-scale trade war, and it was defused. Trump told reporters on Air Force One that the rare earths agreement is a 1-year deal that would be very routinely extended as time goes by. 1 year. That's important. China hasn't given up the weapon. It's just agreed not to fire it for 12 months. Third, soybeans and agricultural trade. China pledged to resume purchasing American soybeans. This is not a small thing politically. American farmers, particularly in the Midwest, a critical voting bloc for Trump, have been hammered by Chinese retaliatory tariffs. The soybean pledge gives Trump something tangible to show his base. He posted on Truth Social that China had agreed to purchase of massive amounts of American agricultural products. China's Ministry of Commerce was more measured, simply saying both sides had agreed to expand agricultural trade without providing specific numbers. Fourth, port fees. Both countries agreed to suspend fees on each other's ships for 1 year. This had become a point of serious friction in the commercial shipping sector, and the temporary suspension brings relief to businesses on both sides. Fifth, entity list suspensions. China's Ministry of Commerce announced it would remove 31 American companies from its export control list and 10 from its so-called unreliable entities list, a Chinese blacklist that restricts business dealings with targeted firms. Beijing also suspended plans to add 11 additional American drone and defense companies to that list for 1 year. On paper, this looks like progress. And in some ways it genuinely is. The world's two largest economies were on a trajectory toward a total trade rupture that could have sent shockwaves through the global economy. That rupture has been avoided for now. But here's where the analysis gets interesting. And honestly, this is where you need to listen carefully, because what the deal looks like on the surface and what it means in terms of geopolitical leverage are two very different things. Multiple analysts from institutions like Brookings, the Atlantic Council, and Piper Sandler reached very similar conclusions. In this round, China came out ahead. Think about it. China imposed export controls on rare earths on October 9th, just 3 weeks before the meeting. Those export controls created a crisis for the United States. And in response, the United States reduced tariffs. China didn't give up the rare earth weapon. It just agreed not to use it for a year. And in exchange, it got lower tariffs, the lifting of several entity list designations, and the suspension of port fees. Wolf research strategist Tobin Marcus wrote to clients that China had successfully used the rare earths export controls and a soybean embargo to force the U.S. to lower tariffs. Piper Sandler analyst Andy LaPerriere was even more blunt, telling clients that China is getting the better of the U.S. in these recent truce negotiations. And there's a historical irony buried in all of this. China made similar promises about soybeans and fentanyl during Trump's first term and didn't fully deliver on them. So the question isn't just what was agreed. The question is, will China follow through? And what happens in 12 months when the rare earth pause expires? Meanwhile, the hardest issues weren't resolved at all. Taiwan wasn't seriously discussed. Trump himself told reporters that Xi didn't even bring up Taiwan during the meeting, which surprised some analysts. Think about that for a second. Taiwan, the island that China claims as its territory, the issue that many military experts consider the most likely flashpoint for potential armed conflict between U.S. and Chinese forces, wasn't on the agenda in any meaningful way. The Atlantic Council noted that while there may now be a truce of sorts on trade, there is no truce in the ongoing struggle for the future of Taiwan. The fate of TikTok was also left unresolved. The popular social media platform, owned by ByteDance, a Chinese company, has been the subject of intense political pressure in the United States, with lawmakers and security officials arguing it poses a national security risk due to its data collection practices and potential ties to the Chinese government. Discussions about TikTok apparently took place on the sidelines, but no deal was announced. And the structural issues, China's market-distorting industrial subsidies, its state-directed economy, the overcapacity that floods global markets with cheap goods, those weren't touched either. The Brookings Institution noted that the commitments outlined in the deal primarily roll back the escalatory measures imposed since early March, meaning the deal is essentially a return to a slightly better version of where things were before the spring escalation, not a genuine structural breakthrough. So, what does all of this tell us about the relationship between these two superpowers? It tells us that both countries have discovered something uncomfortable. They need each other far more than either wants to admit. The United States needs Chinese rare earths. China needs American markets for its exports, which are crucial to keeping its domestic economy afloat amid a serious property crisis and flagging consumer confidence at home. These two economies are so deeply intertwined that a genuine decoupling would be catastrophically painful for both, and frankly, for the rest of the world too. But here's what's changed under Xi Jinping. China is no longer a supplicant. It is no longer the country that quietly absorbs pressure and relies on patience. She has built China into a country that has calculated its leverage points with extraordinary precision. The rare earths gambit wasn't an accident or a panic move. It was a card China has been preparing to play for years. China has invested heavily in developing its processing capacity, in locking up supply chains, in creating the exact kind of strategic chokehold that allowed it to sit across from the most powerful man in the world and extract concessions. And Trump, for his part, did what Trump does. he declared victory. On a scale from 0 to 10, with 10 being the best, I would say the meeting was a 12, he told reporters on Air Force One. 12 out of 10. He called it an outstanding group of decisions. He said he and Xi agreed to almost everything. And heading into an election cycle with American farmers squeezed and markets nervous, a deal, any deal, was politically valuable, even if the underlying dynamics favor Beijing. Now, let's talk about what this meeting means for the rest of the world, because the ripple effects go far beyond Washington and Beijing. For Europe, which has been scrambling to negotiate its own access to Chinese rare earths, the Busan deal is a warning signal. Washington is cutting bilateral deals without coordinating with Brussels. Europe wants the same exemptions, but without the tariff leverage Trump has wielded, Beijing is far less incentive to offer them the same terms. For America's Asian allies, Japan, South Korea, Australia, the Philippines, the message is mixed. Trump was physically present in the region, which mattered symbolically. But the trade truce raised questions about whether economic accommodation with China might come at the cost of firmness on security issues, particularly around Taiwan. And on the technology front, one very telling absence in the Busan deal was any loosening of U.S. export controls on advanced semiconductor chips. This had been rumored in the days before the meeting, creating enormous anxiety in Washington and among allied governments. The rumors were false. Export controls on high-end chips remain fully in place. That matters enormously because the chip war is arguably more consequential for the long-term balance of power than the tariff war. Artificial intelligence, quantum computing, advanced manufacturing, those are the real battlegrounds of this century. And on that front, the structural rivalry continues uninterrupted. Following the in-person meeting, Trump and Xi held a follow-up phone call in November, discussing Ukraine, Russia, fentanyl, and farm trade. The Chinese side noted the relationship had maintained a steady and positive trajectory. Diplomatic language, carefully chosen, meaning both sides are managing expectations more than celebrating a genuine breakthrough. Here's the bigger picture that I want you to take away from all of this. We are living through a period of fundamental restructuring in the global economic and political order. The post-Cold War era, the era of globalization built on the assumption that trade and economic interdependence would eventually bring political convergence, that era is over. What's replacing it is something messier, more competitive, and more volatile. The United States and China are the two poles around which the rest of the world is being forced to organize itself. And neither pole is stable. China is dealing with its own profound domestic challenges. The property crisis, triggered by the collapse of developers like Evergrande, has wiped out trillions of dollars in household wealth. Consumer confidence is shaky. Youth unemployment has hit alarming levels. The deflationary pressures gripping the Chinese economy reflect a deeper structural imbalance that Xi Jinping's government has yet to resolve. China needs its exports. It needs economic growth. And it needs stability in its external relationships to focus on managing the turbulence at home. The United States has its own vulnerabilities. The dependence on Chinese rare earths is a national security liability that cannot be solved overnight. Building new processing facilities takes years. American farmers need export markets. Financial markets hate uncertainty. And domestically, the political pressure on Trump to show results, economic results, not just rhetorical victories, is real and growing. So in that context, the Busan meeting was less a geopolitical masterstroke by either side and more a mutual acknowledgement that neither country can afford the full consequences of total economic war. It was a pause, not a peace. A ceasefire in a conflict that hasn't been resolved and may not be resolvable without deeper structural change on both sides. The Brookings Institution put it well when it said the deal represents more commotion than motion. That's a phrase worth sitting with. Because the commotion is real, the headlines, the dramatic tariff numbers, the rare earth crisis, the dramatic handshake photos at a South Korean airport. All of that is real. But the underlying motion toward actually solving the structural problems that make U.S.-China competition so dangerous, that motion is slow, fitful, and deeply uncertain. Trump plans to visit China in April. She is expected to visit the United States, possibly Palm Beach or Washington, at a later date. Those meetings will be closely watched, because the one-year timers that were set at Busan will be ticking. The rare earth pause expires. The tariff truces expire. The entity list suspensions expire. And when those clocks run out, the two sides will need to have made progress on the harder questions, or find themselves right back where they started, or somewhere worse. Here's what I want to leave you with today. The meeting in Busan was important. It mattered. It prevented an immediate catastrophe. But it did not resolve the fundamental tension between two superpowers with incompatible visions of what the global order should look like. The United States wants a world where democratic values, open markets, and rules-based international institutions prevail. China under Xi Jinping wants a world where state capitalism is legitimate, where political systems are not subject to external judgment, and where great powers carve out their own spheres of influence without interference. Those visions don't reconcile easily over soybeans and one-year rare earth pauses. The real story of this meeting is not just what happened in that room for 100 minutes. The real story is what it reveals about the world we are entering, a world where economic interdependence and geopolitical rivalry exist simultaneously, where the most important relationships are also the most contentious, and where the decisions made by two men in a room in South Korea ripple out to affect the price of groceries in Sao Paulo, the supply chain of a factory in Germany, the salary of a tech worker in Bangalore, and the security calculus of a government in Taipei. That's the world we're living in. And that's why understanding this stuff matters, not just as geopolitical entertainment, but as essential context for navigating your own life in the 21st century. If you made it this far, you are exactly the kind of viewer this channel exists for. Hit that like button. It takes 1 second, and it genuinely helps this content reach more people who want to understand the world at this level. Subscribe if you haven't already. And leave a comment below. Do you think the Busan truce will hold? Do you think China played its hand better than the United States? Because I read every single comment, and this is a conversation worth having. We'll be back with more. Stay sharp.